Today, I am joined by Rachel May. Rachel brings us a wealth of experience spanning over 2 decades in the field of speech language pathology. Her professional journey has encompassed diverse settings, including long term care facilities, schools, clinics, inpatient and outpatient hospital environments as well. Rachel is a 2003 graduate of the University of Florida, where she earned both her BA and Master's in Communication Sciences and Disorders. Rachel grew up in sunny South Florida, just like me, but moved around the country, always in the spirit of adventure. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on today. Does that cover everything, or is there any other background that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, that's great. Other than I moved to the Pacific Northwest, and so this is where I call home these days. And today I'm joined by my incredibly talented colleagues, Sheila and Amber. And I feel so incredibly fortunate to be working with and learning from them both. So I'd like to introduce them. Sheila is a licensed occupational therapist with over 27 years of pediatric occupational therapy experience. She graduated from the School of Occupational Therapy at Texas Women's University and has lived and practiced in both Texas and Washington State. She has had tons of experience working with populations in various settings, including neonatal intensive care, hospital pediatric inpatient and outpatient settings, early intervention, and even skilled nursing facilities. She is certified in both pediatric and infant neurodevelopmental treatment, or NDT, and specializes in sensory processing disorders and sensory related feeding difficulties.
Wow.
Yeah,
Quite a resume. Yeah.
she's pretty amazing. And then
I
Amber is
smile.
incredible too. Amber is a licensed physical therapist who graduated with her Doctor of Physical Therapy degree in 2019 from Slippery Rock University. Amber has 5 years of pediatric and adult physical therapy experience under her belt. And she's always had a passion for working with children and families and began working in pediatrics prior to her graduation through her clinical rotations. Her career allowed her the opportunity to work in settings such as adult orthopedics and general rehab, private practice, as well as pediatric private practice. Following her family's move to Germany, she was given the opportunity to serve families through telehealth in pediatric early intervention setting.
Amazing. I love the collaborative effort that you have brought today. We've got a PT, an OT, and speech language pathologist. And I'm really excited to talk about what it means to think outside the box in private practice. So, what prompted you to begin your own independent private practice, and what key insights should others know about?
Yeah, that's a great question. In my early years as a speech pathologist, I really just grew kind of restless with the status quo. I worked for a few years in adult rehab and long term care, and then kind of noticed patient care wasn't as important as financials were, which makes sense in a big business, but it burned me out. And then I next turned to a setting that housed children with duly diagnosed intellectual disability and emotional disturbance. And that was really trying. And then I was kind of just searching and stumbled across early intervention. And the person that I had met that was starting his own company was so small that I was inspired to kind of start my own as well. So I was housed under him. And that's when I opened up my first private practice. I was so thrilled by the ability to work as long or as short as I wanted to. And I enjoyed learning about the billing aspect of private practice. And I really did grow proficient at billing both Medicaid and private insurances. And ultimately, I really enjoyed the freedoms that come along with being your own boss. But I will tell you, Vanita, it is not for the faint of heart. If you're not passionate about it and 100% committed to working after hours, meaning nights and even weekends, stick to being an employee.
Mhm.
If you dislike having difficult conversations with people and would prefer to a manager to handle it instead, you might want to stick to being an employee. And also, if you're not financially prepared to kind of coast on fumes on later times, keep the job with a steady paycheck and continue to be employee. I will say that entrepreneurship is in your blood. Either it makes your heart sing or it doesn't. And if you're unsure and would like to try it, gosh, I suggest kind of pairing your passions. Let's say you're an avid runner and you're also an advocate for NICU babies. One way to kind of test the entrepreneurial waters might be for you to organize a 5K benefiting your local NICU. And using an idea like that combines your passions and requires you to kind of learn marketing and money management and a host of other skills that will likely shed some light about how you really feel about all the soft skill requirements that are needed to become an entrepreneur. And I just want to share with the audience too to remember there's nothing wrong with what makes you happiest. You don't need to do something or prove anything to anybody but yourself.
I completely agree with you. I love that you didn't put the pressure on people listening to this podcast to go off and start their own business. Like you kept it very real and said, here are the benefits, but also if you prefer these things, then this is probably the better way for you to go. I feel like I am feeling that to my core right now. I have multiple businesses going on and I'm starting to grow my private practice. I had held off for so long because I knew what the time investment would be. And I had my other businesses. So I was like, I cannot commit to that right now. But given the choice between working for somebody, which I have done, time and time again, or working for myself, like in my blood is the entrepreneurial spirit. My dad's an entrepreneur. My husband's an entrepreneur. His parents are entrepreneurs. I enjoy doing jobs, and you probably feel this too, like, you work so hard for somebody else, and then you hit, like, a ceiling or, like, you have to run something by somebody, and having that freedom and then the flexibility is just so appealing when it comes to, entrepreneurship and private practice, but it is not easy for sure. So, thank you for sharing those both sides of it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Anybody else want to add on to that before we go to the next question?
Well, I just think that, putting time and investment in your own dream and your own interests versus a company's goal, mission,
Mhm.
interest, and their dreams for their company, that makes a difference,
For
right?
sure. I was talking to a business mentor about this, and we were talking about the steady paycheck. Like, yes, it would be really appealing to go and get a steady paycheck right now in like a part-time position, but what am I going to do in 5 years? Now I know I have no intention of like staying with somebody else for 5 years because my goals are my dreams and my business and serving my community in the best way that I know possible. So that's a short-term fix versus the long-term goal. So I know it's a luxury to start a business too, right? Like I think that you have to be in a certain position where you can take that risk and not everybody is in there. That's why I love to talk about the side hustle aspect as well. Like you don't have to leave everything to go start your business. And I know you probably feel like this too, Rachel. Like when you are so passionate about something, it's not work, it's passion. When you don't enjoy something and you're working after hours, it does feel like work. So when you're starting a side hustle, sure, it's going to be done outside of your regular job. It's going to be in nights and on the weekends. But if you're really passionate about it, then it doesn't seem like work.
Yeah, totally. I think, it's that phrase, if it makes your heart sing, you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
If you're thinking dread, like, oh no, I've got to get this, this billing done, and I'd really rather be spending time with my family or going out or, whatever you want to do with your free time, then that's really telling you a lot too.
Yeah. That's a great way for people to kind of gauge where they're at, the dread versus the heart singing.
Yeah, and Michelle Obama in her book tour for her book Becoming, she said something I'm going to paraphrase. It was kind of you can be great at everything, just not all at once. So you can
Mm,
be the best mother. You can be the best SLP or clinician or whatever you want to be. You can be the best spouse or partner, but you can't be them all at the same time. It's not physically possible.
right.
And I really kinda took away from too, like, there's chapters in our lives that we can also look at and kinda go, "Okay, well, what's this chapter gonna be like? What are my passions? What do I really wanna focus on? What are my loves?"
Yeah. I love that. So, can you elaborate about what makes you so passionate about working with children and their parents and caregivers?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. There's so many factors for me that more fully answer this question. I personally have not been blessed by motherhood myself. And I think that being able to work and play with babies and toddlers and their families has really helped to promote that healing in my own heart. I'm a kid at heart myself. So I love this population of early intervention because I get to be silly and make little ones laugh, or they make me laugh, and we're just, cracking each other up. And when parents can do that too, that's where my heart sings when we could foster that within families. Another thing for another big pull for me, and this is my own ego talking here, is that it makes me feel good to think that by coaching a family how to better communicate with their child and support their child's communicative development, that I'm helping to change the trajectory of that family forever.
Mhm.
I'm helping to change that family's culture, reduce the stress for all involved when communication's not easily flowing. And then hopefully, when that child grows up, they're going to have all these happy memories rather than frustrated memories and be able to pass that along too. I'd like to share a quick story with you if that's okay.
Yeah, I would love that.
So, to set the setting, I live in a rural community in the Pacific Northwest. The county I live and work in is over 1,700 square miles. And I've been the sole treating SLP in early intervention for the last 6 years. So, we don't even have any private SLP clinics here. And so, if you wanted outpatient services, you kind of have to go to the outpatient facility at the hospital. And just before the COVID era of our lives, I had decided to transition to telehealth because traveling that, 1,700 miles weekly was just in circles was just wearing me out. Anyway, I remember that when I first transitioned to telehealth, I was working with a really sweet family who wanted weekly services. And the mom showed up every week and was diligent in practicing, everything that we talked about and the strategies. And interestingly, this mom had already had early intervention in home, in person, the really talented SLP for her older son only a few years before her experience with me. And I should also share that mom was pretty skeptical about the transition to learning the skills to help her son communicate on her own. She really kind of enjoyed that more outpatient type of setting or practice. And I'll admit I had to be patient and trust the process myself because with all my experience, I could have likely helped that younger son begin communicating more quickly if I had treated him in an outpatient clinic. But you know what? That mom at the end of our year together shared with me that she felt our time together was such a fantastic use of her time that she felt more bonded with her younger son because of the process. Yeah, she felt more bonded to her younger son than she did her older son, which is kind of sad, but it's because she did the work.
Right, you
Um,
empowered her to do it.
yeah. And, I'm only in the child's life for a few years. The parents are with them forever. So, in my opinion, I'm doing my best work if I can support families on how they choose to manage their child's needs rather than to quote unquote fix it and move on. It's kind of like how we used to teach children hand over hand assistance and,
Mm,
we asserted ourselves and our feelings and what was right for the child instead of letting them learn and giving them the support they needed to kind of learn it on their own timeline. And it's just like that old proverb, if you give a person a fish, you feed them for a day and basically they continue to rely on you and not
mhm,
themselves. Versus if you teach them the fish, you feed them for a lifetime and you really help them be more self-sufficient. And one last thing to add is that because I have come across people, not just SLPs, but just people in general. And I'd like to share that if you think that keeping your knowledge and skills to yourself is, if you think sharing, I guess, your knowledge and skills is going to put you out of a job, you're never going to be without work in this field.
yeah,
Never,
it's true.
you know.
Thankfully, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's just it's never ending, right? So I think the more we can empower families and to empower them with their kids is that's just my philosophy.
Yeah. No, it's a good one, I agree with you. What do you guys think about that?
Absolutely. The learning that takes place is in that place of discomfort, right? So if you can provide security and comfort within that discomfort, that's where the learning takes place for you, the family, and the child. So it's about being comfortably discomfortable because you want the learning to take place, but you want to make it be that support, that security, that provide that space where they feel supported so that change can happen, a shift can happen, and happen in a positive way.
Yeah, I love that. You were gonna say something to Amber, right? I heard you say
Yeah, just along the lines of sharing knowledge versus keeping knowledge. I've always been taught, if you love what you do and you're working, you want to work so hard that you're trying to put yourself out of business. Because if you've put yourself out of business, then you've reached your goal. You've done everything that you can do to serve that population that you're working for and working with. So it's a wonderful thing to be able to work in this setting, and especially through telehealth, to be able to talk these parents through their day-to-day lives. We can come right into their living rooms, right into their kitchens, into their laundry rooms, and help them along through their day-to-day life, instead of seeing them in a clinic where you're bringing them into a foreign room or a different environment where they're not necessarily going to have the applied knowledge to be able to apply the skills you're working on with them in their natural environment. But if you're in telehealth, you're just right there with them. And for me as a PT, if mom says to me, this kiddo is really struggling to crawl upstairs, well, I can say, all right, walk me over to the stairs and show me. And then I can kind of help talk through what I'm seeing from the kiddo, and then explain to the caregiver, the mom, the dad, how to assist them with their hands. Um, all while I'm just a little box in their home. So they get to feel what is happening with their child's body with their hands. And then they can do that every single time that child is trying to crawl up the stairs until they're successful. It's not just me helping them climb up a set of 3 steps onto a treatment table in a clinic. And that's not going to be easily applied to their home environment where they see and climb the stairs 3, 4 times a day.
Yeah, makes sense. Anything else, Rachel, before we move to our next question?
No, yeah, no, I think that was great.
So, in your observation, what are the biggest trends in parenting and how might they contribute towards developmental delays that we're seeing?
Okay, so this is a loaded question, and it can also be a soapbox topic of mine, so please bear with me. Let's face it, our society is continuously rapidly changing. It's the evolving landscape of parenting is complex. It's influenced by societal shifts, environmental changes, technological advancements, and technology is improving at breakneck speeds. And our brains and our bodies are really just trying to keep up. For example, I've worked with families that were unaware that there are certain pervasive chemicals found in foods, such as like a red dye number 40, which is a synthetic dye made from petroleum, which may, quote unquote, cause disruption to behavior in some kids. So, disruption to behavior typically will make learning more challenging. And if parents are unaware of that, well, then they're going to, it's like one layer, right, of what may be causing some factors. There also seems to be a rise in food sensitivities or allergies, seeming to come from, you know, cause or contribute to general gastro discomfort or upset. And gosh, Benita, I've worked with so many children in the last few years that are on a daily laxative regimen. And that if they're not given their daily regimen, the child is constipated for days. And I mean, can you imagine having persistent GI issues and then being tasked to learn new things when you're not feeling your best?
Right. Like, think about when you have a stomach ache and then you try to get work done. It's so difficult. Yeah. And then if you have a child who is non speaking or minimally speaking, you don't actually know how they're feeling. That could be displayed in the behavior that they're exhibiting, whereas they're just not feeling well.
Yeah, and I mean, like you just said, when we apply it to ourselves, we are functioning, well-formed adults. Like we're not in the middle of all this brain development trying to learn all these things. And the other thing that, I like to kind of just look at the bigger picture and link things. So if we look at an infant, for example, that has some chronic belly troubles, how can we really expect them to tolerate the amount of tummy time that they need?
Mhm.
Could you lay on your belly if your tummy bothered you?
Yeah. No,
Uh,
my daughter was colic, so I feel this.
yeah.
I I go back to those times. That was tough for sure.
For sure. Yeah, and so then if they're not getting on their belly because their bellies are upset, like, what other delays does that cause?
Mhm.
And then, there's another one with food, and it's just there's so many products out there. There's one I had a family not long ago who the little girl asked for drink. No, she said brisk. She asked for brisk. And I was like, "What is that, mom?" And mom goes, "Oh, it's this really nice juice that, she has every day. She loves it." And I said, "Oh, is it really juice?" She said, "Yeah, it says it on the label." I said, "Let's go get that. Let me see it." So she grabbed it and she said, "See, it says juice." And I said, "Turn it over. Let's just see, what's on the ingredient list." And she turned it over and I said, "Look for caffeine. It should say no caffeine." She turned it over and it said contains caffeine. And this little girl she was thinking was ADD, who didn't sleep, who, was jumping all over the place, just totally dysregulated. So, and the poor little thing was only sleeping, I think, 5 hours a day. So, and as we know as adults, poor sleep leads to poor outcomes. So imagine how it's impacting the mind and body,
How
and
much
that's
caffeine
just,
was in it? Do you know?
I don't, but for a toddler, they shouldn't have any.
Right. Well, I want to know now. I'm gonna look it up because I was just listening to a podcast the other day and they were talking about like the recommended amount of caffeine for adults. I think
Hmm.
it's around like 250 and one
Hmm.
latte is between like 100 to 250. If you have two lattes, like that can contribute to poor sleep in adults. But yeah, that is something to really consider with children, and not just like that drink has caffeine. Chocolate, like the cookies that they have, the cakes that they have, like my daughter's a 3-year-old in preschool, and the amount of like sugar that they have in the week is just astounding.
Yeah.
Like, that's the hard part, unless you say that you don't want your daughter to participate in those activities, or your
Yeah.
child to participate in those activities, but who's gonna do that?
Right. Well, and the thing that made me really sad for this family was that mom read the label on the front and it said juice. And so that's what she thought it was. But when the little girl said brisk, I was like, wait a minute, I know what that label is, but mom just had no clue. So she was totally innocent and believed the label that she had read. And then was totally shocked when she turned the thing over and it said no juice, contained in this product. She's like, what?
And
So
Rachel, correct me if I'm wrong. I think you also mentioned to me that it said no juice added.
yeah, right. Yeah. So it was marketed as juice, and this is what's happening. So, rounding it back to, what things can contribute to delays, poor sleep. How are you learning?
And if you're a person who doesn't sleep well anyway, who has sleep disruptions anyway, who's wired to not have good sleep, any type amount of caffeine, even a tiny bit, can really be super disruptive.
Yeah, wow. My husband and I were talking about food and diet the other day because my daughter was exhibiting some symptoms of the absence seizures. Like she would stare
Mm.
off into space and we would wave our hand. She wouldn't respond to us. I actually had a client years ago, just one around the same age, who I thought was having them and she ended up getting diagnosed with them. So we were looking up, okay, like what do you do if that actually is the case? And it sounds like they don't like to recommend medication always. One of the first things they recommend is a diet change to a keto diet. And right before that instance that this happened the other day, she had a major boost of sugar from some type of dessert. And she was super hyper too and talking a lot. So I wondered if that was related. So we were talking about as a family, like we need to cut out the sugar from our household because, like we were just saying, they're getting it in the school already. We don't need to add on to that at home too. But this is the like fourth time that we've noticed that. So we're just going to keep an eye on it and see, like you were saying, when those happen, there's no learning occurring. And if they happen multiple times a day and no one's catching it, they don't know what to like look for because it just looks like they're staring off into space. They can be seen as like inattentive, like they're not listening. When they come back from those seizures, they're a little bit dazed and confused. So, and the fact that changing the diet actually is like the first course of remediation was really fascinating to me.
I'm thrilled to hear that. And not that your daughter was having these things, but I'm thrilled to hear that they're looking at nutrition as one of the courses of action rather than just going straight to medication. Like
Right.
that that's wonderful because if you are still having the factor that's causing it and you're on medication, well, what are you doing, right? Like,
Right.
what's going on with that poor little one's body?
Yeah.
And then here's another one. So our general environment around us, there are toxic heavy metals like lead everywhere. And lead's really seriously, you're drinking a Stanley?
Yeah. I can't give it up. But is it that bad? I didn't like read the reports. I mean,
So there is a consumer advocate that I follow. Her own children were lead poisoned. And so she's made it her like life's mission. Her handle is Lead Safe Mama on
okay. I'm
Instagram.
gonna look it up.
And she's actually she was the consumer advocate that tested that Stanley Cup and called the company out.
Wow. How do you test for
Yeah.
that stuff? Does she talk about it? I'm sure she
Yeah.
does.
Yep.
Okay.
She does. Yeah. In fact, she
Lead
has a
safe mama.
documentary on her website that you can watch that you'll be blown away about it. But basically, lead's still pervasive in our environment. It's outlawed in paints for like interior, but it's still being used for exterior applications or industrial applications. And it becomes dust, which we then inhale. So, and that's just lead. That's not all the other toxic heavy metals that are in our environment. Our state of Washington has picked up the baton to help inform the general public about environmental toxins. And they've created this program called the Toxic Free Future Coalition. And you could look that up at toxicfreefuture.com.
Okay.
But they're striving to educate parents and caregivers and members of our society at large about the steps that people can take to improve their indoor air quality. That's another thing we don't think of. And a host of other topics, including what topics to avoid purchasing. So, for example, fabrics treated with flame retardants are extremely toxic, and yet they're all over kids' stuff, kids' clothes, kids' toys, kids or furniture and car seats. They've even shown that those chemicals are found in breast milk now.
Really? Wow.
So one thing that they mention, and I'll quote them, they say that children are especially vulnerable to toxic chemicals because their bodies are still developing. And chemical exposures can come from a variety of products, including toys, personal care, furniture, clothing. And it can be daunting to figure out how to minimize chemical exposures to your kids in your home, in your daycares, in your schools, but it shouldn't be. And they offer many cost-effective steps that you can minimize your chemical exposures. So, a chemical exposure may be a contributor to a delay, or even in like Lead Safe Mama's case, intellectual disability due to lead poisoning.
I was gonna say, what are the effects of some of the top toxins? What are the symptoms?
That's it. I think that there's so many. I'm not the expert in this. This is
Mhm.
just something that I am curious about, and I am all about sharing this information so that, you can, like with your Stanley Cup, you can kind of go, oh, hey, now I know, now I
Mhm.
can make an informed decision. That's all I want to do, is to just help people understand a different perspective and just make informed decisions. It's cool. Do what you'd like to do. No shame. But I think if you don't have that choice, if you're not informed, you're not making a decision. You're just kind of possibly exposing yourself to things that you might not want to if you
Mhm.
knew.
Mhm. Yeah, I
I
definitely wanna look more into, like, the long-term effects and the symptoms and how to get tested. You're making me curious about it, so thank you for sharing.
Yeah, well, and
Yeah.
recently too, Vanita, I found that at the 1-year appointments, the pediatricians have started to implement lead testing for all infants unless parents decide to defer it. But we just recently went through that with my daughter. And as traumatic as the experience was of having to, milk her poor little finger for a couple of vials of blood, it's at this point in this time, it's totally worth doing because they're not finding lead in just, the outside of our Stanley bottles or paints or anything else, but they're finding leads in our applesauce packets
Oh my
that
god.
are coming off the shelf at the grocery store, and they're not being recalled. So there are things that are being put into place to help to test our littles for these things, but we are nowhere near a point where they're going to be eradicated from our day-to-day lives.
think some of the effects, I'm not an expert either, on any of this, but I think a lot of the effects that we're seeing is, brain development, neuroplasticity type of interruption of the nervous system, things like that, that um, really causes learning problems, right? Social skills problems, being able to regulate your own system and not have tantrums and meltdowns, and being able to process sensations that come into our body, and not only process it but register it and respond appropriately to those sensations without being hypersensitive to them or undersensitive to them, which dysregulates your body if you're not able to register those sensations. So I think that's kind of the things that we're looking at with some of these toxic type of influences on our system in our bodies.
Makes sense. So you pride yourself in thinking outside the box in your business. What are the benefits of that?
Yeah, thinking outside the box is just intrinsic to me as a human. It enables me to recognize the interconnectedness, and specifically with early intervention, the interconnectedness of developmental domains and how to tailor interventions accordingly. I find it really challenging to look solely at just one area and find all the answers I need there, because we just don't develop one area in isolation. Each domain is influenced by the others. And by embracing a multifaceted approach, I can identify underlying cofactors and provide comprehensive support, whether that be offering educational links or involving allied professionals. And I don't know about you, Vanita, in Florida, but with the more clinical years I'm getting under my belt, I'm noticing that my caseload 20 years ago was pretty much all speech delay, late talkers,
Mm.
and it's kind of changed. Those are now the minority. Those are kind of few and far between, at least in my practice. And many of the referrals that I'm receiving now for speech or feeding delay, after I assess them, I'm finding other cofactors like sensory processing challenges, or that there's a motor concern and the family does not have the energetic bandwidth to focus on communication or feeding as well as the gross motor simultaneously.
Mm.
And it's really how I've developed my latest entrepreneurial venture, which is New Day Child Coaching, and how I conceptualize that. I began to notice that I was often relying on skills that I had learned from working with or taking courses from other skilled professionals. So the PTs, the OTs, the RDs, the mental health pros. And I would share that information to better support each family in their quest for advancing their child's communication or feeding. And began to wonder, I'm like, gosh, wouldn't it be cool if I could team up with allied professionals and begin to describe how even the simplest activity could benefit so many areas of development? And that's when the concept of New Day was just kind of conceived in my mind. And I approached both Sheila and Amber to see if they'd be interested in forming a team together. And as far as we know, we're the only PTOT SLP trio that's kind of interweaving our skill set and knowledge to make child development easier for parents to learn. So, for example, one of the things that we do is we illustrate how encouraging a baby can clap or to clap can benefit social engagement. Imitation can lead to signing more. It can even strengthen their core muscles by sitting. Or if we think of sitting up, if an infant's not learning to sit up proficiently or independently, let's say by 10 months of age, their feeding skills may be diminished because their jaw strength may be impacted. And if they're not practicing soft solids at this age, then their feeding skills may fall behind. And further, if their ability to sit independently remains lacking, how are they going to learn to crawl? How are they going to learn their other gross motor things? And, when we think about it too, a newborn's only a newborn for 4 weeks, an infant's only an infant for a year, a toddler's only a toddler for 2. This time is really short. We've got such small windows to really make an impact before a delay becomes a disorder. And so we wanted to deliver a kind of working example of what this type of collaborative interdisciplinary work looks like. So if you will, I'd like to explore the idea of crawling in a little bit more detail.
Yeah,
Um,
let's do that, especially since they just removed it, right? From the
exactly. So Amber, can you go ahead and give us a definition of crawling along with some of the basics of crawling so that we're all on the same page?
Yeah, absolutely. I sure can do that. So, when we mention crawling, we really want you to imagine a baby who is able to hold themselves up on their hands and their knees with their bellies up off of the ground in that really nice supported hands and knees position. I'll refer to it as quadruped from here on out. So this baby is then, from this position, able to use their arms and legs to move forward through alternating movements of those hands and knees. Crawling really is a pivotal motor skill, and it's not just about independent mobility. It actually prepares the body for more complex movements as we grow and develop. So, crawling really should emerge sometime between the ages of 6 to 9 months of age. And we typically like to see babies crawl for 4 to 6 months before they begin using walking as their primary mode of mobility. And really, this is just so that they are able to have ample opportunity to develop all of the benefits that we're going to discuss moving forward. So, Sheila, I want to hand this over to you. Can you introduce to us the very beginning concept of crawling and why it's so important?
Yes, of course. Crawling begins with this transitional phase between a stationary play and a mobile play. And they start that by getting up on their hands and knees and starting to rock back and forward and backwards, just playing around with that weight shift. And this process is crucial for the development of core strength. So as baby becomes more skilled with crawling and actually begins to move forward with their crawling and not just rocking back and forth and playing around with that forward back weight shift, then they lay the foundations for motor skills for walking, which requires that same play with weight shift, climbing on furniture, climbing in and out of a chair, in and out of car seat, throwing, a ball, and running. But they also undergo essential sensory experiences. Sensory experiences are information that's coming into your body from your environment, but also inside your body that you have to interpret. And these all contribute to overall physical and cognitive development. Without the sensory input, you can't necessarily have as good as or any motor output. So they all kind of work together for both physical and cognitive development.
Did you know all those things, Vanita?
Not from the perspective of an occupational therapist and a physical therapist, but I know there are a lot of benefits. But as you're speaking, I'm also thinking about all of this new information that we're getting in regards to analytic language processing versus gestalt language processing. And I'm wondering, like, is there just one way to learn how to walk, or is there more than one way? Like, and they're still getting those same benefits, but in different trajectories or at different points in time. I don't think there's any research on that, but it just makes me wonder. I love thinking about that kind of stuff. And just given the new information we have about speech development and then working in that for 2 years and seeing the effects of using a different approach, using the Gestalt language processing approach and how it has benefited my autistic clients. I'm wondering, like, let's take the autistic population, for instance, do they develop those motor skills at the same trajectory, or is it possible that there's another way?
Well, we do want to take the strengths of what that individual has and use that to promote whatever type of development that we have. So we want to use their intrinsic motivation. We want to be able to use their strengths as far as what their physical strengths are, their cognitive strengths are, their sensory processing strengths are. And we want to, within a secure environment, provide the just right challenge for them to move forward with their particular need or skill that we're trying to work on. So if that takes a different trajectory, if that takes a different way of doing things to honor that person where they're at, that baby, that child, that family, then yes, that's what we need to do, and always keep that in mind.
Mm.
I want to just say, though, too, that I think just kind of like the informed consent or the informed decisions with, the other things we were talking about earlier, like environmental knowledge, that parents also need to understand the physiological complications or challenges by not crawling. I know that they removed it from the CDC, but Sheila and Amber and I have had extensive conversations about how not having those reciprocal movements at this age really will impact your physical movements as an adult.
Mhm.
So even if a child, goes from sitting to wanting to stand to, like kind of skipping the crawling altogether, the long-term implications for that might affect the person forever. unless they're able to get that kind of, rehab, I guess, as an adult, if that was something that interested them. But I do agree, though, with Sheila that, we definitely want to honor the kids' abilities. But, in early intervention, it's so much about motivation. And so, like Sheila was saying, how to motivate the child to want to do these things can really be the key.
Hmm. If they have like the motor abilities.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Because I was thinking like equating it to speech. If a child doesn't babble, right? Like babbling, we can kind of say, okay, it comes around the same time as we'd like to see crawling. But there are cases like with gestalt language processors where they do skip babbling altogether. But given a different approach versus going the analytic language route, like they kind of meet those kids where they're at, maybe at a later stage, but it all works itself out in the end. So, yeah, I think this is like a whole conversation for another episode. It's a really fascinating topic. And I love that you guys brought it up. I think that it's going to give people listening more to think about, more to research. And yeah, maybe we can have another conversation about this because I think it's super fascinating. And I love that you guys are working together. I know people are kind of moving in this direction. I like actually had just applied for a position where it was like a whole developmental center. So they had a psychologist and a PT and an OT, and they were hiring for a speech language pathologist. So maybe that's the direction a lot of practices are trying to go. But I think it's so beneficial for families. So thank you for kind of, spearheading it, at least in your area.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Benita, for having us on and giving us the platform to be able to talk about it.
It's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of the wonderful things that you're doing in your field and how you all are working together. If anybody's interested in connecting with you outside of the podcast, how can they find you?
Yeah, so we are on Instagram at New Day Child Coaching. We also are in process of designing our website. So it's coming soon, but it's at newdaychildcoaching.com. And if you are interested, you can leave your email, send an email to us, and then we'll keep you on our list for when we are ready to launch and share more good stuff.
Amazing. I can't wait to see your journey unfold. Thank you all for coming, and I can't wait to chat more about this interesting topic. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks, Vanessa.